More than 5,000 Canadians, including our Prime Minister, were in Normandy, France, commemorating the 75th anniversary of D-Day. To talk more about it, along with other big news from Ottawa, is our parliamentary reporter, Ray Filion. Ray, there were some very special ceremonies which took place in France recently, as we remember so many who fought for our freedom.
It was something to see, quite frankly. Many of those veterans in their 90s, even 100, 102 years old, who traveled all the way to France to set foot, in many cases, for the very first time since 1944 on the beaches of Normandy. There were actually 2 days of commemorations. The first was Wednesday. There was a major ceremony on the British side of the English Channel to commemorate the day when most of those Canadians, Americans, British sailors left Britain to cross the English Channel towards France, where they arrived the next morning very early. They stormed the beaches of Normandy under heavy artillery fire. That was a territory that was, of course, in 1944 controlled by the Nazis, but they braved Nazi artillery. They stormed the beaches of northern France, the beaches of Normandy, and that was the beginning of the end for the Nazis, the Hitler regime, the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany. So that was a very moving ceremony on the French side on Thursday, very moving, obviously, on the British side, but also on Thursday when they had a series of commemorations. As I said, many Canadian soldiers, veterans who were there back in 1944, being there for the first time since D-Day. The Prime Minister was there. He actually got very emotional at some point. We saw him wiping tears when he talked about some of the sacrifices from those Canadian soldiers. So very moving ceremonies. And everywhere, Hal, be it in Normandy, be it here, because we had many ceremonies across Canada. They held a minute of silence in the House of Commons. There was a big ceremony at the War Memorial here in Ottawa on Thursday. And the message everywhere is the same. Thank you, and lest we forget.
Amen to that. Now, before heading to France, PM Justin Trudeau made a series of announcements to help seduce female voters heading into the federal election. Let's talk more about that.
Yeah, the Prime Minister traveled to Vancouver on Monday. He was there for 2 days because in Vancouver you had an event called Women Deliver. It was an international gathering of female leaders from across the globe, around the globe. And he announced that the government is going to be increasing funding to support women and girls' health around the world, including abortion services. We're talking big money here, $700 million starting in 2023. Which will increase to $1.4 billion, Canada's contribution by 2029, so in 10 years from now. And the government didn't stop there. The previous day, his gender equality minister announced $300 million for women in developing countries around the world as part of the so-called Equality Fund. So a lot of money. A lot of people will say they're good initiatives, but it's also part of a political game. As you know, Justin Trudeau, ever since he became leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, he's been branding himself as a feminist. He says he's a feminist prime minister. He never misses an opportunity to talk about what his government is doing to advance the cause of women, not only in Canada, but around the world. So he's actually trying to put his money, or Canadians' money, where his mouth is. Obviously, so close to the next election, big money to try and seduce women voters across Canada.
Well, what's interesting too, Ray, is a lot of that money is heading out of Canada, not being spent right here in Canada to deal with the opioid crisis, homelessness, and other issues that we have in our own country. And the federal election will be here before we know it. It's slated for October 21st. Federal Conservative leader Andrew Scheer says Justin Trudeau is undermining national unity. Can you explain?
Well, that's right. Mr. Scheer was in Edmonton this week to deliver the fourth of 5 major speeches he's set to deliver before the end of this month. So he went to Edmonton. He accused the Prime Minister of mismanaging the Federation. He says relations between provinces in Ottawa are at an all-time low right now. He's promising to unite the country if he does become Prime Minister by having this energy corridor that he talked about a few weeks ago. He's also promising free trade between provinces, because a lot of business people will tell you it's very hard sometimes to do business with other provinces. Some say it's even easier to do business with American states than it is to do business with other provinces in Canada, which is kind of crazy. You know, we're one country, should be easier to do business within Canada. Anyway, governments have been talking about solutions for years. Andrew Scheer claims that he has a solution and he will implement it if he becomes prime minister. He also accused Justin Trudeau of turning his back on Western Canada, saying his approach has stoked regional alienation, and we know Western alienation is alive and well these days. You know that better than I do. And he also called on Quebecers to respect oil-producing provinces like Saskatchewan and Alberta, because as you know, in recent months, the new Quebec Premier, François Legault, said a new pipeline running through his province is absolutely out of the question. He's calling on the Quebec Premier to re-examine that. And Mr. Scheer says that if he does become prime minister, he's going to try and convince Quebec politicians to revive some form of Energy East project that would get a pipeline to run from west to east in Canada.
Absolutely. Let's buy Canadian oil. Keep it within the country here. The final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls was formally presented to our Prime Minister. What did Trudeau have to say about it?
Well, he's promising action. He says that the report won't sit on a shelf gathering dust. The word that stood out, obviously, in this report is the word genocide, because the commissioners say they've concluded, based on international law, that this is what's been happening in Canada for decades, a genocide. The word actually appears more than 100 times in the 1,200-page document. And of course, a lot of people are uncomfortable with that. Obviously, when you think of genocide, you think of Nazi Germany, Hungary, Rwanda, places like that, not Canada. Interestingly enough, the Prime Minister didn't mention the word genocide in his speech, the one he delivered at the official ceremony on Monday in Gatineau, Quebec. And this is something that actually disappointed one of the commissioners. She was hoping that the Prime Minister would acknowledge that there has been a genocide here in Canada targeting Indigenous women and girls. But the Prime Minister didn't mention the word genocide on Monday. The next day, during a press conference in Vancouver, he was asked about it by a reporter, and he did say that the Canadian government accepts the Commission's finding that there was a genocide in Canada. So that's as far as he would go. And as I said, 231 recommendations appear in that report. The Prime Minister is promising action. He says there will be an action plan. It's not clear exactly when it will come, possibly this summer. We'll have to keep an eye on that. But among the 231 recommendations in the 1,200-page report, they're talking about a national action plan to address violence against Indigenous women and girls, a national Indigenous and human rights ombudsperson, a commission also to keep an eye on police forces across the country. They're also calling, and this is one of the most interesting recommendations to me, they want the federal government and provincial and territorial governments, so governments across the country, to recognize Indigenous languages as official languages in Canada, on par with English and French. So it remains to be seen how many of these recommendations will be followed by the federal government. 231. Wow. Quite a few.
Yeah, definitely. One of the women who was expelled from the Liberal caucus, Jody Wilson-Raybould, is said to be the leading candidate in her riding. Ray, she's even, in fact, she's ahead of the Liberal candidate right now.
Not by much, but she's leading, according to a poll that was done last week by Main Street Media. If the vote had taken place last week in Miss Wilson-Raybould's riding of Vancouver-Granville, she would have received 28% support compared to 25% for the Liberal candidate. So a three percentage point lead. It's not a lot. 8% would have gone to the NDP, 8% to the Green Party. 14% of people in that constituency in British Columbia say they're still undecided. Main Street also conducted a similar survey in Jane Philpott's riding in Ontario, in the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, the riding of Markham Stouffville. And she's facing longer odds than her friend Jody Wilson-Raybould in BC. If an election had taken place last week, the Liberals would have won with 35% of the vote. compared to 30% for the Conservative candidate. And Miss Philpott would have received 19% support. 10% of voters in Markham Stouffville say they're still undecided. The race was close in that riding back in 2015, with Jane Philpott defeating her Conservative opponent by 6 points. So we'll see what happens.
Isn't there talk as well of Jane Philpott potentially going back to the Liberals?
Well, she said she was actually asked the question recently, and her answer was never say never. But I don't see a way for her nor Jody Wilson-Raybould rejoining the Liberals as long as Justin Trudeau is Prime Minister. I think there's some bad blood between the three of them.
Now, explain to our viewers what powers a partyless or independent MP has in Ottawa if, in fact, they have no party affiliation whatsoever.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, they don't have as much power to influence things because we have a party system here in the House of Commons. When you're the government, you're very powerful because you can talk to the Prime Minister, you can present a bill as a government bill. When you're by yourself, it's much, much more complicated. Very, very few private members' bills actually become law. It hasn't happened very often in Canadian history that's happened. You get to ask a question every once in a while, but maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks. You don't wield a lot of power.
Oh, I can imagine, yeah. Now, in spite of frustrations in many parts of the country, and new reports as Canadians actually support equalization, but Ray, I can tell you right here in Alberta, right now, not so much.
Yeah, that's right. That's a survey from Environix Institute that found that a large majority of people outside of central Canada feel their province is not respected within Canada, is not getting its fair share of federal spending, yet 3/4 of Canadians across the country support the equalization program. Only 16% don't support it, according to that survey. As you said, and not surprisingly, most people in Alberta and Saskatchewan, that's where political leaders have complained that their oil money is being used to finance services elsewhere, most notably in the province of Quebec, which in turn opposes new pipeline projects. So opposition is higher to the equalization program in Alberta and Saskatchewan. One surprising finding of that survey, Hal, only 13% of Canadians feel that their province is wealthy right now. Back in 1977, that figure was at 54%. So obviously, a lot of Canadians don't feel good about the way things are in their province right now, or the direction of their province.
There's another trade issue with China, and this one involves all Canadian shipments of pork. Can you explain?
Yeah, China announced this week that they're going to be systematically inspecting every single shipment of pork coming from Canada. That's because the official reason that they gave is they're afraid of some bug, which is known as the African swine fever, which is something that has never been found here in Canada or in Canadian shipments. China claims it has absolutely nothing to do with the current controversy over the senior Huawei executive that was arrested here in Canada, the request of the Americans in early December. So yeah, one more issue. First, it was canola. Now, an issue over Canadian pork being exported to China. The Agriculture Minister, Marie-Claude Bibeau, this week said that she's advising Canadian pork producers to make sure everything is properly labeled, that they follow the rules to a T. The Canadian government has also let it be known that they might ask for a face-to-face meeting between Justin Trudeau and the Chinese president at the upcoming G20 summit, which is going to take place at the end of the month in Japan, to try and sort out the many issues between Ottawa and Beijing. They just keep piling on.
Right. A Tory MP from Alberta made headlines for all of the wrong reasons this week. Michael Cooper was expelled from a Commons committee. What happened?
Well, it all started last week during a committee meeting discussing online hate. Witness, who is Muslim, said that the shooter in Quebec City who killed Muslims at a Quebec City mosque 2 years ago was actually inspired by conservative commentators and others. This is something Conservative MP Michael Cooper took issue with, and things got heated. And at one point, Mr. Cooper cited from the manifesto of the shooter who shot people to death in 2 mosques in New Zealand a couple of months ago. And so that was controversial. Andrew Scheer said he had a look at the issue. He decided to expel Mr. Cooper, not from caucus, but from that committee. So Michael Cooper is no longer going to be sitting on that committee. I guess Mr. Cooper could have expressed himself differently. You know, he could have calmly voiced his disagreement that conservative commentators or conservatives inspired shooters in New Zealand and in Quebec City. That's not what happened. He probably went a little bit too far. Now, the opposition have called, not the opposition, but the government has called on Andrew Scheer to expel Mr. Cooper from the Conservative caucus. I think they're also playing political games with that. It's not going to happen. He's going to stay in the Conservative family. But yeah, he made headlines for the wrong reasons this week. And he wouldn't comment, by the way. We didn't see, at least I didn't see Michael Cooper in the halls of Parliament this week.
Our parliamentary reporter, Ray Filion, joining me once again from Ottawa. Thanks so much, Ray.
My pleasure, Hal.